so now we're going to start talking about reinforcement, and we've talked about it a little bit, but it's really, really important that you understand how reinforcement works, because this is going to be the key to changing behavior. I oftentimes tell people, we look at behavior and we think, oh, that kid is having problem behavior, what should I do about it? And we think about, doing something about that behavior that oftentimes leads to, oh, he needs a consequence for that so that he learns that it's not okay. Really, changing behavior has to do with reinforcement. It has to do with finding what you want them to do instead and reinforcing that behavior, because then that replaces the problem behavior. And so that's what's really going to make a difference when we're working with kids with challenging behavior. And understanding how reinforcement works is a really important process. So reinforcement, positive reinforcement, is a consequence that follows the behavior, and it increases the likelihood of that behavior. So again, it's something that follows the behavior and then that increases the behavior. So here's an example. You have a child that you're trying to get them to raise their hand instead of shouting out. So every time they raise their hand, you give them a sticker on a sticker chart, and after they get 5 of them, they get to turn that in and look at their favorite book. And let's say our data shows that yes, they're raising their hand more often, they're remembering to raise their hand, they're not shouting out as much. Then I have reinforcement in place. The positive reinforcement is the sticker, and it's increasing behavior, raising their hand. And that's why it's really important to understand that reinforcement is an effect, not a thing. People oftentimes think about reinforcement as being a thing, like it should be the candy or the computer or the toy. And reinforcement needs to be an effect in that it increases behavior. If it's not increasing behavior, then it's not actually reinforcement. And that will be an important piece that we come up with in order to figure out how to change behavior. So we could have food, drink, sensory stimulation, tangibles, including toys, again, the computer, some of those kinds of things. Any of those things can act as positive reinforcement. But again, giving an example with the little girl raising her hand, this will work a lot better than consequences, because her shouting out is because she has a skill deficit. She doesn't know how to raise her hand as an appropriate way to get attention. So if we said every time she shouts out, she gets a check mark on the board, and if she gets 5 check marks, she loses recess, I never taught her the skill that she doesn't have, which is how to appropriately get attention. So we want to teach her to raise her hand, and then that's going to replace the problem behavior. So one thing that's really important to also understand about reinforcement is that every time a behavior is reinforced, it's reinforced at that level plus some. So an example that I like to give is, let's say you have a mom and dad with a brand new baby, 2 weeks old. It's time for the baby to go to sleep. You wrap them up real tight in a blanket and put them in their bed. They go to sleep. It's pretty easy to put a 2-week-old baby to sleep. Now let's say the baby is 12 months old, so a year old, it's time for her to go to sleep, put her in her crib. What does she do? She really would like to still be up, so she, pulls herself up. She's standing on the side of her crib, and she's fussing and crying and saying mama, and she wants her to come get her. Let's say after about 10 minutes or so, mom doesn't like to hear the crying and doesn't like to hear her baby fussing, so she goes in and picks her up and rocks her to sleep. So mom does that for a couple of nights. After 10 minutes or so, she just goes in and rocks her to sleep. But after a couple days, mom was like, I don't want to do this anymore. I can't keep going in and rocking her to sleep. I'm just gonna see if she can fall asleep on her own tonight. So mom's put her in bed, and she's fussing and crying like she does every night. Mom's in the kitchen doing dishes, so she's trying to distract herself. And after about 20 minutes, she was quiet. So she thought, oh, that didn't take as long as I thought. Goes by her room to peek in. No, dad went in and picked her up to rock her to sleep. So now mom and dad get on the same page, right? It's been a couple of nights. The baby was picked up at 10 minutes and then at 20 minutes. And now mom and dad are saying, we cannot keep picking her up. We need to just let her self-soothe, and we're going to give her a pacifier and a blanket and music and all these things so that she can learn how to go to sleep on her own. So I always ask people, let's say that's the 4th night. Remember, she was picked up at 10 minutes and then 20 minutes. How long is that baby going to cry? Most people will say, maybe 45 minutes or more. Why? Because that child was used to that behavior working. Crying and fussing got mom or dad to come pick her up. So every time that behavior was reinforced, it's reinforced at that level plus some. So if dad picked up the baby at 20 minutes, at 21 minutes, she's not going to stop crying because it was reinforced with a little bit more intensity. And so what happens is that every time we reinforce behavior, even again, if it's not or if it's not intentional, like for example, the child that's having problem behavior and disruptive behavior and is removed from the classroom, maybe we're not intentionally trying to reinforce that behavior, but again, if that gets a kid out of a writing task when they don't want to do writing, then that reinforces that behavior. And again, it reinforces at that level plus some. So some kids can start in the classroom by just saying and pushing a paper away. And then maybe that little bit of disruption made the writing go away. So then the next time, if that doesn't work, they're going to add a little bit more. So recognize that each time we reinforce behavior, it's reinforced at that level plus some. We want to understand reinforcement also so that we can use it to increase good behaviors, because it works the same way for good behaviors. Now, another area with reinforcement is sometimes a little bit hard for people to understand, and that has to do with negative reinforcement. Sometimes people use this term incorrectly, and I think it's confusing because it talks about negative and reinforcement at the same time. But basically, it's when behavior removes something negative and increases that behavior. So think of the word reinforcement as increase. Positive reinforcement increases the child raising her hand. But negative reinforcement is the same thing in that it increases behavior. The difference is that the behavior makes something negative or bad go away. So let me help you with this with examples. If you go into the kitchen and your trash smells, the trash smelling would be negative. So my behavior of taking the trash out and making that negative thing go away increases my behavior in the future. What am I going to do the next time the trash smells? I'm going to take it out, and I might even take it out more frequently so it doesn't get to the point that it smells. Another really good example, this always helps me as well. You get into your car. Most new cars now, if you don't put your seatbelt on, there's an alarm that goes off. It's a tone that's repeated. Well, I don't want to drive for an hour with that tone, so that's annoying, negative, somewhat unpleasant. If I put my seatbelt on, that negative noise stops. What behavior does that increase? It increases me putting my seatbelt on. The reason that it's really important to understand negative reinforcement is part of what I've already described to you. And that is that negative reinforcement increases problem behavior when we remove them. So for example, you give a child a writing assignment. To them, that assignment is negative. You may think it's the best lesson plan you've ever prepared, but to the child, that activity or demand or assignment that you're asking them to do is negative. When their disruptive behavior makes that negative thing go away, they're sent to the principal's office and the work doesn't go with them. That increases that behavior. The reason it's so important for you to understand this concept is because 80% of behaviors in some of the research can be because of escape and avoid. This avoid not wanting to do it and that behavior working, which means that our interventions have to really focus on this escape piece. And within some of this training and these training modules that you're able to listen to, we're going to be talking about Rage to Reason, which is one of the best ways to help with that exact situation of kids that refuse and that it's unintentionally being reinforced and that it's working for them. So it'll be really exciting to learn how to do all of that stuff as well. But this is a big area to be working on. Now, the consequences that follow the behavior result in this behavior happening again. So when we say consequence, a lot of times people think of consequences being something bad, like, oh, he needs a consequence for that. That behavior needs to have a consequence. Really, in terms of behavior, a consequence just means something that happens after a behavior. Now, I'll try to define that well enough so I'm not confusing you. But a consequence is something that happens after a behavior. So if the child raises her hand and I put a sticker on a sticker chart, putting that sticker on the sticker chart happens after the behavior, so that could be considered a consequence. So really what we're saying is anything that happens right after the behavior can be the consequence, and for positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement, it increases that behavior. So positive reinforcement in the form of attention or things increase that behavior or strengthen that behavior, and negative reinforcement in the form of making demands go away also increases that behavior. But it's really important to understand how reinforcement works, and again, remembering that it's an effect, not a thing. Same thing kind of happens when we talk about a consequence which again in the behavioral world is really defined as a punishment, but people don't like talking about punishments, but really anything that happens after a behavior that decreases the behavior is a punishment. But let me give you an example of how we use some of these things, and that we really need to look at what the result is. Remember, effective versus ineffective, so that we can see what's actually going on so we can change behavior. I had a student with Asperger's syndrome that they had asked me to come in and do a consultation for, and he was hitting people at recess. So I was talking to the team, what are you doing about that? Well, if he hits somebody, we take his recess away. I said, how is that working? Well, he's still hitting someone every day. So I wanted to go observe, and I walk outside with the class, and sure enough, this little guy walks right over to the first girl he can find and punches her in the shoulder. So they gave the routine that they always do of, Joey, you can't hit anybody at recess, so now you can't have recess. So they sent him inside. I followed him in, and he went into the room, like kind of the teacher workroom. There was a lady that came in every day as a volunteer to be able to make copies for teachers, and that's where this particular student would go. And so I asked her, I'm like, what do you do when he comes in? And she's like, I don't know, he's in here every day. And I said, what do you do? She's like, I don't know anything about autism or Asperger's syndrome. I know if I put him on that computer over there, he doesn't bother me and I can get all these copies made. Well, this is a particular student who's hitting. The intention is to give a consequence or a punishment to stop the hitting. Oh, you're going to lose recess. But it was actually increasing the hitting. Why? Because he didn't want to be at recess and he ends up getting on the computer. So that was something that we have to look at. We think, oh, we're giving him a consequence, we're doing the right thing. Effective versus ineffective. That's an ineffective strategy. He's still hitting. So taking recess away was not actually acting as that consequence as intended, because it was actually increasing the behavior. And that's why it's so important to stop and evaluate what's happening with the behavior. If we're continuing to do the same thing over and over and the behavior's not changing, again, it's not that you're doing something wrong, but it's definitely ineffective. It's not changing, so we need to look at other strategies. Now, most of the time, these behaviors start as a skill deficit. The skill deficits that we talk about have to do with the skill deficit of communication, the skill deficit of emotional regulation, and those kinds of things. We see those things as skill deficits, but then they're strengthened and continue as the result of reinforcement or consequence. So again, the same example that I gave, the little boy having the tantrum, he's having this little terrible two tantrum, perhaps because he couldn't have candy. That was a skill deficit. I don't like being told no. I don't like being able I don't tolerate frustration very well. But then if mom says, okay, fine, you can have just one, then that strengthens it. So recognize, again, it starts as a skill deficit, but if we reinforce the behavior by something that happens afterwards, we can end up strengthening that behavior. And then we've got two things going on. We've got the fact that the kid's not very good at regulating emotions, doesn't have good communication skills, but it also works for them in some way. And that's where all of those things really need to be addressed in order to change behavior. So one of the things that I really have been trying to get across to lots and lots of people on the training that I do, is understanding and asking yourself a new question. So most of the time when you're working with a child who's having a behavior, the thing that pops into our mind is a question, oh, what should I do about this behavior? And that oftentimes leads to a consequence. Oh, well, he needs a consequence to know that this is not okay. I want everybody to start asking a new question. I want you to ask the question, what do I want him to do instead? Because again, that's going to get at that skill deficit and be able to teach the child by reinforcing that skill deficit. So let me give you one more quick example. I had a student, Sam, with autism. He loved to be on the computer as a reinforcer for him. So when he got all of his work finished, he got like 10 minutes on the computer. So if he's sitting here on the computer and a teacher came and stood right next to him, when the teacher stood right next to him, he would hit them right in the stomach. And my thought is that he really didn't like it when a teacher came over, because he would oftentimes do Lion King on the computer. And when a teacher came over, they sometimes made him turn Lion King off and do a math activity, right? So he didn't like somebody standing right there, he would hit them. Well, the behavior plan that he came with, because this was my first year with him, the behavior plan that he came with said that if he hit or kicked, any aggression, he would lose all reinforcement for that day. So the plan was that when he hit, I was supposed to say, "Oh, Sam, I'm sorry, no computer the rest of the day," and turn the computer off. Well, if you've worked with these kids, you probably know what happened. He had this huge outburst and all this behavior. He's upset, he's mad, he can't have the computer, and we didn't get anything done the rest of the day. But I really felt like we weren't asking the question, what do we want him to do instead? Because I felt like he didn't have the communication skills to be able to say, "Hey, can I do Lion King without you standing right here next to me because I'm afraid you're going to ask me to do math?" Well, that's a lot of language for him to come up with. I wanted to start with something simple and concise and very clear. So what I did is I just wrote on a piece of paper, it was like on an index card, "Go away, Mrs. Bowie." Now, don't worry, we did make it a little bit more polite at one point, but I wanted it to be very clear and easy for him to do. So he's here on the computer, and I come and stand right next to him, and he's about to hit me. I'm just blocking that, and I'm kind of showing him the card, and he says, "Go away, Mrs. Bowie." I said, "Great job, Sam," and I step away. And so that actually replaced the behavior very quickly, because that is what he was trying to communicate, and I taught that skill deficit. Before I was taking the computer away, now he can use his words and ask me to go away. Now I shaped that into, "Please, can I be here by myself?" or "Please, will you go away?" And then I even taught him to tolerate having a teacher there. So I would stand next to him, he'd say, "Go away, please." And I would say, "Sam, that's a nice job using your language. I'll go away after I count to 5. And I would count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then I would step away. So I was teaching him to tolerate having a teacher there, because at some point I do want him to turn Lion King off and to go ahead and do something on the computer that has to do with math. And so I think it's just a really good example that when we ask ourselves, what do we want them to do instead, we are guided towards coming up with the intervention that's going to change the behavior. Giving a consequence to a behavior can sometimes change a behavior, but oftentimes when that consequence is not in place anymore, the behavior goes back. If we're dealing with a skill deficit, teaching them communication, teaching them frustration tolerance, teaching them problem solving, any of those kinds of things, we're actually able to change behavior because we're teaching the deficit that's causing the behavior in the first place.